This is something that many Democrats have said Republicans are going to have to contend with, because a Quinnipiac poll out last week showed that 75% of respondents, of Americans, wanted to hear from witnesses. And what we didn't hear is a good reason why, with the drip, drip, drip of evidence coming out, particularly from John Bolton, but also from Lev Parnas, information about Pat Cipollone and about Mick Mulvaney, the president's acting chief of staff. Why not hear from the witnesses?
Well, Ollie, what we've seen is that every time a new piece of information has come out in this entire proceeding, even going back to the House proceedings back in November, it was bad for the president. No piece of information has exonerated Trump. It's only raised more questions about him as well as his inner circle. The people leading his defense have become implicated in the potential crime here. And so they have every interest in ending this as quickly as possible. They knew that if they let John Bolton testify, that means they'd have to let Mike Pompeo testify, Mick Mulvaney testify, Rudy Giuliani testify. Every time that new information comes out, it extends the trial, which puts the president in danger. They knew they needed to end it right now. They are betting, Ollie, that despite what the polls say today, that nobody voting in November is going to care what happened in January.
How we're not familiar with this, Joyce. Most people, we have impeachment trials very infrequently, except in the case of judges, and even then, it's fairly infrequent. What impact do you think this trial and its incompleteness will have on the American psyche and our view of institutions like the Senate?
So I think you're highlighting one of the, key risks that we see here going forward. Our institutions work in large part because people have some confidence in them. Now we've seen a trial process that was completely dysfunctional. No witnesses. We all know that that's a trial that we see in Alice in Wonderland, not in America, right? I think that there's no doubt that this spills over into our criminal justice system, maybe into our civil justice system, where people have less and less confidence in the ability of judges and juries to resolve their problems. As far as this particular situation goes with this president, I think Kurt is right. The American people have short attention spans. Whether this still resonates in November is an interesting question. But because this trial was incomplete, there is more evidence to come out, and it will continue to come out in drips, maybe sometimes in a flood. I think it's too early to close the book on the president yet. Certainly he's not been exonerated.
But, Kurt, and I want to remind our viewers, you were a Republican, not just a Republican, a pretty serious Republican. This president continues to not be hurt politically with his base by any of this. There is no piece of information. There are viewers of mine who think, well, if only you would report on this and people would know that X happened with Mick Mulvaney, with Pompeo, with Bolton. Bolton's book is going to be out soon enough. Does anything move the president's supporters, or is he right in his statement that he made so long ago that he can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and it won't make a difference?
So that statement was prophetic, because what we've seen, whether
because it sounded remarkably stupid at the time.
It did, but it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the thing. We saw after the 2018 midterm elections an electoral shellacking, frankly, that Republicans endured. And yet not one thing changed with their steadfast support of this president. They are all in with Donald Trump. They would rather incur the wrath of the voters even than the wrath of the president's Twitter feed. They are so baked into Trump world now. There is no separation between the Republican Party and Donald Trump. They are now one in the same. And I think that what we've seen throughout this entire process is no matter what Trump does, they do the same thing, whether it's John Bolton, whether it was Steve Bannon at one point. If someone is contrary to the president, they attack him. They attack the people reporting on him. They say that person is lying. They're distrustful. And everybody turns on them. And what information comes out from this point forward, whoever it is, whatever they say, the same cycle will repeat itself.
What happens in this instance where I look back at 1974 and Richard Nixon? Republicans did change their mind at some point when evidence came out that changed public opinion. Yeah. We have seen evidence come out that does alter some public opinion, like the 75% of people who wanted witnesses. That's not 75% of people saying they wanted to see Donald Trump removed from office. They said, let's hear from the witnesses. Does it matter now that we have politicians and institutions that say the facts don't matter, the facts are not important to hear, or as we heard from Lindsey Graham, it doesn't matter what your facts are, I've made a decision?
So it's an amazing thing that they've been able to convince their voters that that's true. And I think this is part of the Trump populist mentality. People who were looking, for maybe some way to burn down the system in some sense Something that Kurt and I have talked about that I think makes a lot of sense here is when we look at these national numbers for people who want to hear from witnesses, they're just that. They're national numbers. They're not state-by-state numbers. And because impeachment is not purely a legal process, it's at least partially a political process, senators in states who knew that their voters were less concerned about the integrity of the trial and hearing from witnesses were more likely to be willing to ignore these traditional American norms that we value. Like, trials are supposed to be about getting at the truth. This trial clearly was not about that. It was about, as Kurt says, lining up behind the political cult of personality that surrounds Donald Trump.
What happens next, Kurt? How does this play out in the 2020 election? There are vulnerable Republicans. There are Republicans who are up for election, but not vulnerable, but subject to some criticism because they're running an election coming up. And there are Americans who have said that the normal processes at play that we thought would hold the president to account, including the Mueller investigation, and now this, have not worked.
Yeah, I do think that Republicans will pay a price for the appearance that fairness is really what's been injured here. I think that the American people overall, and Joyce talked about this earlier, they subscribe to some idea that our systems are set up in a way to be fair, and that no matter what the end result is, we arrived at that conclusion because truth was allowed to happen, fact was allowed to be prosecuted. And in this case, they were robbed of that. And people generally don't take it too well when you take something so fundamental away from them for purely political and partisan reasons. So I think that there is going to be some type of reckoning at the polls. And Donald Trump, his advisors will tell you this, he can't help but talk about the things that have injured him on some level.
Yes.
He will never get over the permanent stain of impeachment that's now affixed to his name. So even though he shouldn't talk about it, he will spend from now until November relitigating this. And every time he does, it will give Democrats an opportunity to remind them that you may have been let off by the Senate, but it wasn't a real exoneration. And I think that could become a mandate against him in November.
Thanks to both of you for joining me this morning, Kurt Bardella and Joyce Vance, former